Muy buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos y muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta importante jornada.
Welcome to this very important event.
Be very, very welcome in Casa Árabe.
Thank you.
We are very proud and very happy to have you here. La señora Armstrong, a quien estoy seguro de que casi todos ustedes conocen, es profesora, es experta en historia de las
An
religiones.
expert in the history of religions, and she's also a specialist, a scholar
de las religiones comparadas.
on the story of compared religions.
La señora Armstrong,
Mrs.
fue
Armstrong,
en su juventud
when she was young,
comunista,
was a nun. She
fue
became a
una
nun,
religiosa durante 7
and
años.
she spent 7 years in a religious order, if I'm not mistaken.
Posteriormente, al cabo de 7 años,
And after 7 years,
abandonó la orden
she left the convent
y comenzó una vida nueva en la
and
universidad,
started a new life
donde comenzó
in
una
Oxford
carrera
at the university when she started a new career as an English lit professor.
abandonó esta
But after
carrera
a while, she also left this behind,
pasó una temporada bastante
and she
dificultosa,
spent
confiesa,
some disappointing years, she tells us. And it was then when she devoted her time to studying the history of religions, and she became very popular around the world. She has written and published many books, close or more than 30. History of God is one of them, and then a wonderful book on Islam, a short story, the Bible, a biography, the Great Transformation, and Muhammad, a prophet of our times, another book about Buddha, the Buddha. So she's written extensively, and I could mention most of her books. It will take me a long time. Most of them have been translated into Spanish. I encourage you to read them. But if you perhaps less patient, you can visit social media and other platforms where you'll find extremely interesting conferences. There are many available on YouTube. So, after many years devoted to the history of religions, she's been awarded with different prizes, including the Freedom of Worship Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Award in 2008. Also, in this very same year, she was awarded with a TED Prize, which led her to launch a campaign in favor of a charter of compassion that she drafted herself. And a long list of individuals and institutions have supported this initiative. Perhaps she'll tell us something about this charter of compassion later. And I'd like to underline 2 ideas that drew my attention. Her famous golden rule: don't do unto others what you don't want others to do to you. And the second idea that I find very beautiful is that from tolerance we have to start, from tolerating the others, we have to start appreciating them. So you have the floor.
Right, thank you. It's great to be here, back in Spain. I wanted to call this speech Islam, a colonial religion. And that got some questions from the staff here who said it was probably a bit obscure. But what I had in mind was that in the post-colonial period, the West has really called the shots on what they regard as religion. It's always happened. We've proceeded through history with various empires. Spain has been an imperial power. Britain has been an imperial power. And for over nearly a millennium, Islam was a very great imperial power, a major global power. It was a religion of extraordinary success. 60 years after the Prophet's death, the Arabs, a people outside civilization, no one went into Arabia in those days. 60 years after his death, the Muslims were in charge of an empire that was the largest that the world had ever seen. And that gave a sense that the Quran says that societies prosper if you live in a certain way. And the loss of that, by the beginning of the 20th century, most Muslims found themselves living under Western rule. And the shock has been profound. It's been compared to the shock that some Christians have experienced with the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin, which sort of undermined their sense of themselves, their sense of religion, and have produced a certain form of fundamentalist Christianity where people feel very much on the defensive. It's been said that, that perhaps the difference between Muslim people and the United States, for example, is that the difference between a religion, a people that is conscious of past glory and one that is enjoying present glory. And we tend to call the shots. When we look at other people's scriptures, we tend to see it as going along with our idea of it. So if the Bhagavad Gita, for example, seems to recommend warfare, we're shocked because Hinduism, as we call it, that's a religion actually invented by the British in the imperial period. Hinduism is supposed to be a peaceful religion. But then all faith traditions, whatever they are, have in their scriptures, in their texts, a mixture of the violent and the compassionate, because that's the sort of people we are. But in the West, we have always had a particular problem with Islam. Because when the West was beginning to rise out of the dark age that descended upon the whole of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire there, one that lasted for decades, for centuries, Islam was a great, great world power and resented in rather the same way as many people resent the United States today. We, ever since the Crusades, when it was actually Christians who made an absolutely unprovoked attack on the third holiest city in the Muslim world, massacred umpteen numbers of people, so much so that 5 months later, they had still not been able to bury all the bodies. It was after this shocking act of violence, which violated everything in the Gospels, which speak of peace and love, tells you to love your enemies, not to exterminate them. The West projected perhaps a buried guilt onto Islam and saw Islam as the violent religion. And today, I mean, it's regarded as inherently violent, misogynistic, antagonistic to other faiths, and addicted to authoritarian rule, can't be in tune with the modern world. But how did this come about? I want to just look at 3 of the topics this evening that we often worry about, or is a matter of concern to many people about Islam. First, jihad, of course. The word jihad, as it's used in the Quran, does not mean holy war, as it's usually translated today. It means effort, a struggle, and it's associated in the earliest surahs not with violence at all, but rather with a non-violent response to violence. Muslims are told when they were being attacked in Mecca by the Quraysh, who ruled Mecca, Muhammad's tribe, for groveling on the ground like a slave when they made their salat, their prayer, they would be attacked. And the Quran is saying, no, make a jihad and don't respond violently. Now, there are, of course, but later when the Muslims migrated from Mecca to Medina and founded a Muslim society there, they were at war with Mecca, who was determined to wipe out this Islam. And during this war, there were times when Muslims had to fight. Now, some of these verses are being constantly quoted by people today. The famous Jihad verses, the famous sword verse, for example, slay them wherever you find them, etc. Interestingly, I'm writing a book about scripture at the moment in all religious traditions. And interestingly, for the first 400 years, exegetes said that these verses about jihad were no longer applicable. They were referring specifically to events in the Prophet's life and had no relevance today. It was talking about the pagans of Arabia. Well, by this time, there were no pagans left in Arabia. The whole thing was therefore null and void. You begin to get a concentration on these verses later, at the time of the Reconquista. One exegete said that if we had been less peaceable, we wouldn't be experiencing this warfare from the Christians today. Similarly, in the Middle East, at one point, for a period of some 100 years, Muslims were being attacked on two fronts, by the Crusaders from the west and the Mongols from the east, who took away vast swathes of Muslim territory. And it is then that you begin to get a belligerent translation of these verses. But the early exegetes, who you'll all have heard about these famous hadith, these traditions that talk about the martyr enjoying 73 virgins in paradise, about how jihad is the sixth pillar of Islam, that fighting a war for Islam is more commendable than praying beside the Kaaba or making the Hajj pilgrimage. Now, research shows, however, that with these traditions, you have to look at the isnad, at the chain of transmitters. And these particular warlike hadith were transmitted by people associated with the Umayyad imperial government, who were waging expansive wars. The 93 virgins and the fact that idea that you'd be sitting in silk clothes drinking wine in paradise, it's a way to try to get people to join the army. Which would require you for years to be away from home, away from family life, enjoying no sexuality, living in these garrison towns. And it was a way of making jihad sexy, as it were. But the lines of transmitters are highly suspect, because it's very easy to create these sort of wannabe verses and thus distort the whole tradition. I'm intrigued by the story of the Crusades. The Crusaders in 1099, after a hideous journey in which many of them died like flies, fell on the people of Jerusalem, and the chroniclers say they murdered 30,000 people in 2 days. Now, you always have to take these medieval chroniclers with a pinch of salt when it comes to numbers. But certainly, 5 months later, when Fulcher of Chartres, one of the chroniclers of the Crusaders, visited Jerusalem, he came for Christmas, And from afar off, the stench of decaying bodies met him. There were so many bodies lying around that they'd be the crusading people who stayed on in Jerusalem were unable to bury them all. And now you'd think that after such an onslaught on what is the third holiest city in the Muslim world, there would have been a massive Muslim riposte. Not a bit of it. The Crusaders who stayed on created the first Western colonies, 5 little states in the Near East. And they were attacked by the local emirs who went on fighting one another, as usual, for territory and wealth. And sometimes these emirs would ally themselves with the Crusaders and they would fight together against a neighbor. They would make these alliances. It was not for about 60 years before the arrival of the Second Crusade that Muslims started thinking this is not really acceptable. Hordes of people coming in from Europe, vowing to wipe out Islam. And so but even so, it took Nur ad-Din and Salah ad-Din some 70 years to build up a strong jihad movement. The jihad was completely dead, and it had been revived as a result of a sustained assault from the West, and has never entirely left. Empires are always violent. An empire always leaves disgruntled and sad people behind. And that's certainly occurred in the Muslim world as a result of Western imperialism. But we must look clearly at what Muslim problems are and what they are not. You see, one of the things we blame them for is their lack of appreciation for the secular ideal. Now, the secular ideal is great. It was a creation in the West after the so-called wars of religion. And John Locke, a British person, a British philosopher, advocated the idea of toleration. I don't like the word tolerance. It comes from a Latin root, tolerare, which means to put up with something, to endure something. And I think we need to do more than that today. It's the language of the victor who decides what he will tolerate and what he will not tolerate. But keeping religion and politics separate is good, especially, and it should be good for religion, because it should free religion from the inherent injustice and belligerence of the state. What it's done, however, all too often, is make religion, as Locke said, a purely private search, so that you're just concerned with polishing your own soul and your own relationship with the divine, and are not being forced, propelled, as all the scriptures in all the world traditions to tell you, to help to heal a suffering world. The Quran is a cry for justice. Jesus made the same claim. The prophets of Israel confronted their leaders and insisted that they treat the poor with decency. People like Isaiah had no time for Israelites who simply said their prayers nicely in the temple, but neglected the plight of the poor and the oppressed. Even the Buddha, whom we often see locked in meditation, deep in a tranced yoga, when he certainly did a lot of yoga, but he also insisted that his monks go out to heal the suffering world. That's slightly been lost now. And I was been talking this afternoon to journalists. We're not seeing religious leaders, say in London, for example, coming forth to cry out against the injustice of the fact that last winter, which was a particularly cold winter, there were record numbers of people in one of the richest cities in Europe sleeping on the streets. There should be, religious people should be making an outcry about that. The Quran is all about a cry for justice. Now, when you come to modern terrorism, people often say, well, without these hadith promising the martyr all these wonderful rewards in the hereafter, there would be no terrorism. This isn't the case. If you take the suicide bombing, for example, Robert Pape of the University of Chicago had made a study of every single suicide attack that had occurred within a 30-year period, ending in about 2008. And he found that it had nothing to do with religion. The first people who pioneered this were the Russian atheists, the communists, early in the century. Then the Tamil Tigers, who have little time for religion, perfected the whole method and became, until the Iraq War, the undoubted the stars at the number of suicide bombing created. Pape found that it wasn't really religion, it was more nationalism that caused this. It occurred when a country which people regarded as their homeland was invaded or taken over by a superior power, as Lebanon was, for example, attacks were occupied by the Americans and by the Israelis in the 1980s. It comes from a sense of imperiled nationalism rather than religious fervor. And people have actually gone into, social scientists have actually made studies of the people who were involved in the 9/11 attack. One, Mark Sageman, a sociologist, interviewed all the people in Guantanamo who were linked with the 9/11 catastrophe. And he found that only a tiny percentage of them had had a regular Muslim upbringing, that most of them were either new converts to Islam and therefore knew very little about the faith, or they had been not observant until they joined the movement. And he found again that what was motivating this was often a sense of foiled nationalism and a concern about the plight of Muslims in various parts of the world. There was a Gallup poll taken after 9/11. It was the largest poll ever undertaken by Gallup, which went into 35 Muslim-majority countries and took 7 years. And one of the questions they asked was, were the 9/11 attacks justified? Only 8% of those who responded said yes, they were justified. And the reasons they gave were entirely political. They quoted the issue of Palestine, for example. The 93% who said they were not justified all quoted from the Quran. And their reasons were religious, that the Quran says that to take one life is to destroy the entire world. We never go to war for a single reason, and we never commit terrorist acts for a single reason. Historians of warfare tell us that there are always multiple factors involved, largely economic as much as anything else. And obviously, ideology merges with this. But just to dump it all on religion we are just not looking clearly enough at the situation in which we find ourselves. I rather dread getting into a London cab sometimes, and if I have a chatty driver, he'll often ask me what I do for a living. And when I say I write about religion, I wince because I know what's coming. Up comes the well-worn phrase, he says, religion has been the cause of all the major wars in history. And it's chanted almost like a mantra in the same series of words every time. It's got lodged in the secular consciousness. But it's just not true. And if we want to see our situation in the present world rationally, we can't just jump at some easy slogan like that. We've got to see all the factors that we're dealing with. Now, the second thing that Islam is blamed for is misogyny. That Islam is down on women. Well, frankly, all religious traditions have been a bit chauvinistic. Certainly, if you look at Christianity, for example, an important note here is that St. Paul did not write all the letters that are attributed to him in the New Testament. He wrote only 7 of them. And in those 7, Paul, who believed that Jesus was going to come back and found a new world, the kingdom of God, in his own lifetime, was promoting a radical egalitarianism. In Christ, he said to the Galatians, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. And in his letters, in his churches, you can tell from his letters, there were as many women leaders as men. But later, when it was appeared that Jesus was not coming back anytime soon, Paul had to be reined in. And in the 2nd century, early 2nd century, you have the epistles to Titus and to Timothy, which say the women must know their place, and they must not preach, and they must not and they must follow the household codes practiced by the Greek and Roman Greco-Roman society. All those passages where Paul, who's not really Paul, says, wives be obedient to your husbands, slaves be obedient to your masters. These are quotations from Greco-Roman household codes. So that happened in Christianity, a complete turnaround. And in Islam, too, we have women were among the first of the converts. And equity is central to the Quranic message, as it was central to Paul's message. Its bedrock message is that it's wrong to build up a private fortune, but good to share your wealth fairly with others and create a just and decent society where the weak and vulnerable are treated with respect. And that includes women. But, in Islam, too, male jurists tended to take over. And the same happened in Buddhism and Hinduism, certainly, because basically, even when I was growing up, my mother used to tell me, women must take a subservient place. She changed her tune slightly, but towards the end of her life. But that was still customary. There's been some very interesting developments since the 1980s, which Western people don't normally hear about, that women, for the first time, are beginning to make an interesting exegesis on the Quran and on Muslim history. They highlight one incident, which I think is very significant in the Muslim tradition, which is carefully preserved. The Prophet had a large number of wives. This was not a love nest. These were largely political alliances. He was building a confederacy of Arab tribes, and sometimes when one tribe came into the confederacy, he would marry one of the chief's daughter or his sister in order to build relationships. And he also cemented relationships with his companions by marrying their daughters. But one of them was an extremely intelligent woman, an Salama, and she soon became the spokesperson person for the women of Medina, who came to her one day and asked her, why are women not mentioned in the Quran? So she took that to the Prophet, and 2 days later, a revelation came to the Prophet, and she was in the next room to him, and she was brushing her hair at the time, and she heard this voice where the Quran talks about believing men and believing women all having the same duties and the same responsibilities and the same promises in Islam. And the fact that this story was so carefully preserved, and that the Quran responded so promptly to Salama's question, shows that a woman's critique was accepted and seen to be important. And just a few days after that, a whole surah, Surah 4, was revealed, which gives Muslim women the rights of inheritance and divorce that Western women wouldn't receive until the 19th century. Still not as good as the men, but absolutely astronomical in 7th century Arabia, where women had, as I say, virtually no rights at all. For example, when a woman got married, her husband would give a dowry to the bride, who would remain in her father's house, while he visited his many other wives who were dotted around in other people's houses. The male of the family, simply absorbed this dowry into their own property. The Quran says no. That dowry remains the woman's inalienable possession. It's hers, and hers to do with what she likes. And if there's a divorce later, the husband may not keep that dowry. It stays with the woman. So these rights of inheritance and divorce were revolutionary. The men were furious. But a revelation from the Quran came down and said, no, this is how it is to be. So the Quran, and we're hearing it so much, aren't we, about the veil these days. The Quran seems entirely uninterested in women's headgear. There are only 2 passages in the Quran that deal with women's dress. In one, both men and women are urged to dress modestly and in a seemly manner. And in the other was entirely time-specific and obviously related to a slave-owning society that was no longer in existence. There was a problem in Medina that Muhammad's enemies were attacking Muslim women when they got up at night to relieve themselves. And then they said, oh, so sorry, we thought you were slave girls. We didn't realize you were sort of proper women, and not good at all, obviously. And so the Quran comes out and says no, tells women to wear distinctive robes so that they will be recognized and not mistaken, and this nefarious habit attacks are not made. Now, some male exegetes go on talking about this, but they point down, they still say that this long jilbab should be worn by women, but the reasons they give is that women are weak and vulnerable and liable to sin, whereas this is a revelation about male debauchery and male sexual misdemeanors. Now, there is one, however, verse in the Quran that is worrying, which because it seems to give a license to attack what they call nushuz, high-handedness in a wife. It's forbidden, and then it says, and if she doesn't behave herself, he says, first, don't go near her in bed, and finally, keep silent, and finally, it says, hit her. Now, this seems to give a mandate for wife-beating. But it's interesting that this surah really worried males as well as females from the earliest time because it contradicted the sunnah, the customary behavior of the Prophet Muhammad. Because it was well known that the Prophet never beat his wives. He was regarded, in a time where, this is a society where violence to women was just everyday events, but he was regarded as eccentric, really. He said, that he wanted, and one of his early biographers said, he never raised his hand against a woman or a slave, or indeed anybody. So how was one of the tests of is that the Prophet's behavior must be a guide to the way we interpret the Quran. Well, exegetes today, male as well as female, have pointed out that Arabic, as you know, is a polysemic language. A verbal root can have several meanings, and D-R-B, which is translated hit, it can also mean to leave someone, to abandon them, to go off, to leave them alone. And the Prophet did once leave his wives alone when they were clamoring and they were arguing very stridently against the whole Quranic ethos of equality, that their family should have a biggest share of the wealth in the community. And the Prophet was having none of that. And when they wouldn't listen, he went off for a month and lived in a little apartment by himself. And finally issued an invitation to them, which is preserved in the Quran, where he asked them, he said, look, either live a good Quranic life, not lusting after finery and wealth, or else I will give you all an amicable divorce. The women agreed that they would, that they came down from their position and marital relations were resumed. So some exegetes say, well, we could translate this as, so leave them alone until they've come to their senses. And there's also another verse in the Quran later in the same chapter, which also says that high-handedness, nushuz, is also forbidden to husbands, something that jurists didn't always remember. Would it be a problem to change it? Well, not really, says one leading exegete who now teaches at the University of California in Los Angeles. No, he said, because a text that remains closed remains dead. That we must always be aware of new interpretations. Now, one of the things I've discovered in my research for my book on scripture, which takes in all religious traditions, Chinese and Indian, as well as monotheistic, is that this harking back to the original text is really a modern practice. It's very much influenced by our academic concern in the universities for the sanctity, the integrity of the original text. But throughout history, the scriptures were always used as a sort of springboard to bring something new. It was the scriptures would be interpreted and I can give examples of this in question time, if you like, always to answer a particular dilemma now, and to change it and make it speak to the present. Otherwise, scripture remained dead. And the third thing I want to discuss is pluralism. Pluralism was a modern idea and very, very necessary in our horribly divided world, where we're seeing a sort of disease of nationalism cropping up all over the place, Brexit being an obvious example, against common sense and against the way the world is becoming more and more global. In the Quran, pluralism is seen as God's will. There's a wonderful text that where God says to the prophet, if it had been our will that you should all form one single ummah, one single community, we would have arranged it like that. But this was not our will. The Quran takes it for granted that there will always be religious disagreements among people. But it says that instead of quarreling about various theological niceties and saying who's right and who's wrong, instead, this verse goes on to say, instead vie with one another in good works. Compete with one another in doing good for the world, not in engaging in these sterile theological ideas. You see, when we exalt our own faith at the expense of other faiths, this is ego. We are identifying with it at too profound a level. In the old days, before modern communications, we knew very little about other people's religious traditions. We heard about weird and wonderful goings-on, Muslims running around some building, for example, or Indian people piercing themselves with knives, etc. And it all seemed very weird. But now, in the modern period, with what we've learnt about the profundity of religious traditions, about their profound unanimity in many respects, as well as their intriguing and sometimes very significant differences and insights, this is no longer feasible. But people find it very alarming. And the more global people's religious ideas grow, the more other people are retreating into little doctrinal ghettos. And you have what we often call fundamentalism, which has developed in every single tradition as a response to modernity, which I could talk about a bit later. But of course, once you become an empire, as Quran did, then of course Islam did become the faith of the empire, and the others were tolerated. And that gave people the wrong idea. And what's happened too, I think, in the last 30 years or so, after the Iranian Revolution, Saudi Arabia has been very active in promoting its highly minor form of Islam, Wahhabism, which dates back only to the 18th century. A very truncated form of Islam. But they have had the petrodollars plus international support to export this around the world. And it has, a whole generation has grown up with these kind of limited teachings, which certainly sees Islam as the one true faith. I think what we all need in today's world to be a little less righteous, a little less smug. How did I get into all this? I never intended to do any of this at all. My plan had been to be an English literature professor, and I had one series of utter career disasters and found myself writing about religion. And I had been a nun as a young woman and came away from it thinking religion was all rubbish and I wanted nothing to do with it ever again. But this changed as I started, after a series of career disasters, I found myself making television programs about religion in the Middle East. And I found that there was things in Judaism and Islam that I could really relate to and which showed me what my own Catholic tradition had been trying to do at its best. And so my ideas began to change. But how did I get into Islam? Talking about Islam, because it occurred at the time of the Rushdie crisis. When if you remember, there was a fatwa against Rushdie, which I highly disapproved of. But I also disapproved of the way the great and the good in Britain, famous novelists, philosophers, poets, etc., were coming out in the Sunday newspapers saying Islam was a bloodthirsty, evil religion, quite blatantly. And I had a sense of dread. I said to myself, we've learnt nothing since the 1930s. It was this kind of media campaign that enabled Hitler to do what he did. And at the end of that decade, the 90s, there were concentration camps again on the outskirts of Europe, in Bosnia, this time with Muslims in them. We can never, never say never again. That is there. We've seen what we can do at our very, very worst, and we must guard against it. And a problem, too, is, I think we're seeing, I've touched on it tonight, too, is with Brexit, a disease of nationalism, which is simply an ego inflated, which we identify with the nation. The nation state is a modern invention. It was impossible to create a national identity before modern communications made it possible for everyone in a country to know what people were thinking. People in northern Scotland would feel nothing in common with people in Devon, down in the south of England. They'd never meet each other. But modern communications newspapers created a national spirit, and this helped to mobilize the nation for industry. But very early in this process, a British historian, Lord Acton, made a chilling prediction. He said that the emphasis in the nation state on ethnicity, culture, and language would make it very difficult for people who did not fit the national profile. In some cases, he said, they could even be enslaved or exterminated. And it wasn't long after he wrote those prophetic words that the young Turks, atheistic young Turks, massacred over 1 million Armenians to create a purely Turkic state. Then we had the Holocaust. And finally, Bosnia. We can never say never again. We've seen that possibility is always there. And it's quite natural that we are concerned only with our own dead. But I was very worried during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan because we were quite right to honor the soldiers who came home in coffins, who'd given their lives for this cause, and who died. That's quite right. But there was no public outcry about the very high level of civilian casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq. People who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this was much noticed in the Muslim world. I remember you had Prince Hassan here this morning. And I remember we were together at a lunch at the British Museum. And I said to him, there was what I've just said, that there was no sustained outcry. And we were sitting in a round table, and he reached right across 3 people and held my hand. And there were tears in his eyes. This was felt. That we gave the distinct impression that we regarded some lives as more valuable than others. And I felt this too at the time of the Charlie Hebdo massacre. This was a dreadful crime, appalling. But I was worried that at about the time all this Paris bonanza was going on, there had been a major massacre of people by Boko Haram in Nigeria. 2,000 people were killed, elderly women and the elderly. Tiny little mention in the press compared with our dead. And you remember that march they had? I'm all for freedom of expression. Of course I am. I thrive on it. I exist on it. But there they all were. Remember them? They all linked arms and with the background of Paris behind them, with liberté and the revolution behind them, and freedom and equity, linking arms and marching for freedom of expression. All well and good, but Some of those leaders, including my own Prime Minister, David Cameron, headed countries that had, for decades, in Britain's case for over a century, supported regimes in Muslim-majority countries that allowed their people no freedom of expression at all. We have to sort of dismantle ourselves a little. Free speech is a sacred value to us because it's central to our identity. But we can't take this righteous stance, thinking that we've always been purveyors of free speech for everybody. We haven't. We've had our own failings too. We have to come off our pedestals if we want to coexist in this world. It makes no sense to say one religion is better than another, because we're talking about the divine, which is ineffable. It's indescribable. It exceeds everything we can know and think. And this was standard up until the early modern period. And I'm thinking now of the monotheisms. Thomas Aquinas, for example, he's famous for his 5 proofs for God's existence, all taken from Aristotle, 5 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then at the end of it you've got, this is God. But what nobody reads is the next bit, when he pulls the rug out from under our feet and says, but we don't know what it is we've proved. All we've proved is the existence of a mystery. We do not know what an uncreated being is. Every being that we know comes from something else. And his whole oeuvre can be seen as an attempt to undermine our dogmatic certainties about what God is. As a child, I had to learn this answer to the question, what is God, in the Catholic Catechism. This is the answer. God is the Supreme Spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. I have to say that at 8 years old, that left me rather cold, but I now think it's quite incorrect. God is not a being. We are beings, and the only beings we know are beings like ourselves, well, there was a time when we weren't here, and there'll be a time when we're not here anymore, and we go frail, and we die, and are imperfect. But being itself, esse se ipsum, and he was absolutely at one here with Avicenna and Maimonides. And this is significant. This is the period of the Crusades when Western Christians were slaughtering Jews and Muslims. But here he quotes Avicenna and he quotes Maimonides with great respect as authorities. They all said the same thing. We cannot say what God is. Allahu Akbar. God is always greater than we can conceive. And if we say we do know God, we're just simply reducing him to a being in our own image and likeness. So I often end this talk with this quotation from Ibn Arabi, 12th century Muslim mystic and philosopher. And it was very important to me because after my very dogmatic upbringing as a Catholic, where we didn't even think Protestants had any hope of salvation, never mind Jews and Muslims, etc. I found this a wonderfully liberating quotation. But I'm telling you this, I quoted it once in Lahore. And at the end of it, a man got up to ask a question, but he didn't say, it's not a question. He said, this is what we used to hear in the mosque, but we don't hear it anymore. Saudi clamps have happened, and we think we are the one true faith, where this is simply ego. So here is what Ibn Arabi says. Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you'll fail to appreciate the real truth of the matter. God the omnipresent and omniscient, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah. Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature, and in praising it, he praises himself. Consequently, he blames the beliefs of others, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance. Thank you.
I have no idea. To be quite frank, I have no idea. But there's so much inauthentic speech going on at the moment in all forms of life, and he's playing some game or other. I've no idea what it is. This is abominable behavior in Saudi Arabia. Of course it is, but really, I was appalled by Mr. Trump's response today, saying, well, yeah, this is really terrible, but think of all the jobs we will lose and the money we'll lose if we turn our backs on Saudi Arabia. I don't know what Mr. Erdogan. I really have very little faith in what he says or does. I have dry cleaners who are Turkish, and every time I go in, I'm told at great length about the evils of Mr. Erdogan. I just wish that we could look at Saudi Arabia in a way that does not any longer kowtow to it, and we Britain gives vast amounts of money to Saudi Arabia, and it has been supporting jihadi groups as well as exporting its very narrow form of Islam around the world, and yet we go on in this kowtowing way, just sucking up to him because for money and oil. And it's shameful and irresponsible, and lacking in any kind of degree of integrity at all. What can I say? And I mean, and this murder, just awful. But I'm not so pleased with my own country at the moment. I'm not so pleased with British politicians at the moment. I was just lamenting Brexit is a complete and utter catastrophe, and it's brought the worst down. We don't seem to have any great politicians at the moment. And I think I think of South Africa, and I think that if there were now people of the stature sort of Mandela or Tutu around, moral charisma, or Martin Luther King, people respect charisma, and they go for it. We're not seeing anything like charisma, integrity, vision in our politicians today. They're grubbing around to secure their own little advantages here and there, while the world is in the most dangerous state. I mean, I look at I'm ashamed to be British at the moment. Deeply ashamed.
It makes two of us.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure that that's entirely the case about Christianity in the West. Europe, certainly. My country, most certainly. It's one of the worst markets for my books. Nobody wants to hear about religion at all. And only 6% of the population attend a religious service regularly. And you're right, most of those are Muslims. But in the United States, religion is alive and well. And I know we often see people happy, clapping, and we know all about the fundamentalists, but there's some really interesting and searching religious thinking going on in the United States. It's supposed to be the second most religious country in the world after India. Now, religion's hard to do well. Religion, I see it as, and I say this with great respect, it's an art form. It's always expressed itself best in terms of art, in terms of poetry and music and fiction. And it's at its worst when it tries to express itself in analytical, rational thought. It's an art form that helps us to find meaning and significance in life, just like art does. We are creatures that fall very easily into despair. We have to live, unlike other animals, with the knowledge of our own mortality. And it's very difficult for us sometimes to find a point in life, and art and religion have helped us to do that. When religion becomes inauthentic, however, then it becomes empty, like bad art. You can have bad poetry and bad music, and you can have what the Buddhists would call unskillful religion. And I don't think the British, for example, have ever been very interested in religion. I come from Ireland, and that's a very different culture altogether. But right through history, during the Reformation, when Europe was tearing itself apart, Catholics and Protestants massacring one another, what did we create? The Church of England, a compromise between the two. You know, just let's forget about it, they said. Now, I think what part of the problem that has happened in the West is our emphasis on rational and scientific thought. And we've tried to make religion scientific. All these attempts to show that the Bible really knew all about creation and Genesis. The Bible is not telling us how the world came into being. There are two creation stories put side by side, both very different from one another, each cancelling one another out. They're meditations on life. And nobody wrote history in the pre-modern world as we write it today. It was simply not possible before advanced archaeological scientific study and the scientific study of dating and increase in knowledge of ancient languages made the past accessible to us. We are not very remembering creatures. We forget. But we remember, and so the stories in the Bible, for example, are not meant to be history. They are telling us about meaning. And similarly, the Quran had no notion in the 7th century of a separate, an exclusive religion. Because the Arabs in the 7th century were right outside the quarrels of Byzantium. But in the 18th century, we made, I think, religion incredible by applying science to it. It's like trying to pick apart a novel. When you read, I'm afraid I can only cite an English novel, but Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, you're not dismayed to learn that Mr. Darcy never existed, but you are gaining something profound from this experience. And the stories in the Bible are about this. They're telling us things about the human condition. People wrote history to say what things meant, and we're applying modern science, and it becomes incredible. Also, unless you put your religion into practice, it falls apart. Religion is not a matter of saying your prayers nicely or having a little private devotion. It is you are pushed into the world to do good. The Quran, a cry for justice. Jesus, on the last day, or he said, when the kingdom comes, those who get into the kingdom, to them I will say, I was hungry and you gave me to eat, thirsty you gave me to drink, sick, naked, and in prison, and you visited me. Outreach, active compassion. The trouble with secularism is it's made religion a private search, as Locke said, and then it dies. It dies because it becomes all about me. And so there was my salvation. Am I going to get to heaven? I mean, this is all highly egotistic. It's about the eternal survival of the ego in optimum conditions instead of the surrender of the ego. Islam means surrender. You give it up. And the prostrations of Islam, where you bow your head to the ground, is meant to teach the Muslim through the body of the great abnegation of ego that is commanded, that is required in the religious quest. And when you in 2002 to 3, some sociologists interviewed American teenagers and their parents, and they found that the common religion was something they called ethical transcendentalism, and it went like, well, God wants me to be happy. God's job is to sort of arrange things so that I am in good well-being, etc. And Jesus is my personal savior, as though Jesus is someone like personal trainer in the gym, who is catered for my little needs and my spirituality and my salvation and my well-being, where religion says get beyond all that. So there's a tendency to this privatization of religion. It's helped to kill it. Also, the people notice, for example, you would all have seen that terrible incident last year when that tower block in Kensington and Chelsea burned down in one of the richest boroughs in London. And it was shown, they built a wall between the rich people of Kensington and Chelsea, literally a wall, and the poor people. And that's where the tower block was. And the council had put inadequate, highly flammable cladding on the outside of that building. And when a fridge blew up, the whole building went up. And where was the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Archbishop of Westminster or the chief rabbi? Why were they not there? There was a priest who opened his church to the people. But people noticed that. You see, I think if people started living their religion, then people would see the point of it. But if it's just a question of chanting a few dogmas or some of these hymns, etc., then I think Islam is quite clear that there is an ethical charge, and also I think you've got to the chanting of the Quran, the recitation of the Quran, is an art form. It's reading it, as Western people do, and starting at page 1 and plodding through to the end, is like reading the libretto of an opera. Half of it is missing because the Quran, the recitation, is a highly skilled art that touches the soul, that touches you deeply beyond the reach of words and meaning. And but in Russia, where religion was absolutely dampened during the Soviet period, the churches are now full again. It's come back. And again, you go into those churches and you feel holiness. It's not just someone preaching some mediocre sermon or saying a few sort of self-serving prayers and doing nothing to help the community. But the sound of Eastern Orthodox chanting, no accompaniment, but polyphony at its highest, it touches something profound in us that is beyond words. So I think that it's a complicated question. And about just a good word for the veil, I don't want women to wear anything that they be uncomfortable about wearing, whether that's a hijab or whether it's a modern Western dress. But I was as a young woman, from the age of 17 to 24, I was a nun. And believe me, my religious habit was far more uncomfortable, unhygienic, and unpractical than any hijab that I've seen. Trying to get through the London rush hour in all this. But for all that, from the age of 17 to 24, I never once had to give a thought to my hairstyle, my figure, my makeup, all the junk with which Western society fills women's minds in order to fuel the economy and make us buy all these beauty products. And it was, in a sense, a great liberation. And I think some Muslim women are saying that, too. So I think, anyway, you've had some good, those were good questions, and I've tried to answer them. But unless religion does what it says on the tin, unless it's actually seen to be vying with, not with theological problems, but with good works, and making a difference in the world, why should anybody follow it? Because I often think that I'd have a dream of showing Jesus around the Vatican if he came. And he'd think, what, I did this? We need, that not mean we can all have to go back to first century Galilee, no. But simply that question of giving away everything you have, getting rid of ego, and being generous and working for the good of society and good of the world. Unless religion's doing that, then there's no reason for it to exist. Islam, like as in any other religion, as I said, has just got to put their mouth to walk the walk, and I think people have to see. We have somehow to show people Islam. They said that when you watched the Prophet, you understood the Quran. That's what the whole purpose of the Sunnah, that you watched how he behaved, how he washed, how he interacted with others, and you saw the Quran in action. Every Muslim should be an incarnation of the Quran. And that's hard work, take all day and every day. And every Christian should be an incarnation of the gospel. And every Jew an incarnation of Torah. And that's, we need some charisma here, I think. People do respond to charisma, as I said earlier, but they're not, and it is hard going. I know how hard it is, that the way the media portrays Muslims, always as a problem or as something to be reformed in some way, when God knows we are all floundering and at sea at the moment. And secularism, the modern ideology, how is that portraying itself? Who is walking the walk and showing absolute impartiality instead of this dogmatism and openness of mind? We're not seeing that either, any of us. So that's all I can say to you. That basically, the role of youth, as the role of all of us, is to incarnate the religious traditions, or incarnate our secular ideologies. Let people see what the faith is. Otherwise, why should anybody practice it? And you know, I've just come back. You mentioned my Charter for Compassion. Well, I have to say that the leader of the Charter is Pakistan. Way above anybody else in the, way ahead of the Americans, for example, in terms of active engagement with the community, creative thinking outside the box. Some of them are religious, some of them are more religious than others, some are not religious at all, but they're all working for compassion because they say this is the only way to save our society. That they should be. I'm going to the World Parliament of Religions next week, and I shall be telling the charter people there that they are outdone by the Muslims. The Muslims are leading the way. And while I was in Pakistan, I had a deputation from the government of the UAE who want us to go in there and help them with their new ministries of toleration and pluralism. And that means walking the walk, not just creating a platform where people have conferences where they say how pluralistic and tolerant they are without doing it and somehow incarnating it in life. So the Muslim world is doing pretty good, and they get it. That's all I can say. They get it, and vie with one another in good works. To come back to the Quran. That's what we should be doing instead of arguing about ideologies or the meaning of jihad or the Sharia and all this. To vie with one another in good works and to care for the other. The smallest act of kindness can be the mark, says the Quran, of an entire life. Well, obviously, I applaud it because they're Muslims who've not had a voice in the evolving theological discussion much in the past are now making themselves heard and calling the men to account. And what I'm glad about is that I haven't discovered any stridency about it. I think one has to be firm about these things, but not strident and quarrelsome and self-righteous. That's a hard act to follow. But I think that they are bringing something absolutely fresh to Islam. My friend Leila Ahmed, for example, at Harvard University, who has studied the history of Islam from a female perspective, and Fatima Manissi, who highlights the role of the story I told about Salama. That is very much her take on this. The women's critique is important. But you see, we have to understand, though, that society was, until very, very recently, wholly male-dominated. And that goes for religion, too. But so women, what I'd like to see women doing, not just in Islam, but in all religions, is not just going along with the men. I see some of the women priests who are joined in the Church of England, who are donning the same clerical dress as the men. And what for? Who, really, why bother with a dog collar? I mean, it's only and are just becoming like the men. Let's do something different. Now, every woman, even a highly privileged woman like myself, understands what it is to be denigrated and put down and put into a secondary status. Let's use this as this experience, not just to nurture our own sense of grievance and anger and wrath, which none of these Muslim women are doing, I have to say, but to join up with other oppressed people around the world, to make so that we see that there are all kinds of voices, not just women's voices, that are not being heard and that need to be heard, that need to be brought to the table. And then let's just concentrate on women's issues, but let's take, because what the Quran was saying is, it to Salama is that women are among the people that the Quran has come to liberate, among the many people whom the Quran has come to liberate, including the slaves, including the poor people of Mecca and Medina who were being pushed aside in the stampede for wealth in the new market economy. And in our global world, where we are seeing suffering on such a scale on our television screens, we must make common cause, women, I think, with those other people. And we should let ourselves be upset by this suffering. You probably don't do this in Spain. You're probably too sensible. But, you know, in England at the moment, when you're watching the news, it now seems absolutely de rigueur and required for the newscaster, when something disturbing is about to be come up on your screen, like pictures from Syria or whatever, to say, a warning, you may find this distressing. That gives you a chance to go out and make a cup of tea or switch channels. God forbid that you should allow this, your peace and comfortable evening, to be destroyed by these unpleasant sights. I think we've got now to open our minds and hearts and let ourselves be disturbed by the suffering that we see, to let it sink into us, to let us keep it awake at night. And women can play a role here, because the Quran, as the Quran says, they are just one of the people that the Quran has come to liberate. And we know how it is to be ignored and pushed aside and seen to be of no account. So that's what I would like to see, I think. Just a broadening of outlook, so that we are troubled, all of us, by the distress that we're seeing in the world. Hate a Muslim day. Dreadful, appalling. And this is the spirit that has been unleashed by Brexit.
I can't hear. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
This is the why I see it. I'm ashamed to be British. Deeply ashamed, because things that have been Brexit has allowed this kind of discourse to come to the surface and be accepted. Did I tell them the story about the British Museum? Did I tell you a story about the No, another one. When I was a trustee at the time of the referendum, and I've talked to so many people this afternoon, I forget who I've said what to, but in the week after the Brexit vote, visitors were coming to the British Museum and they were yelling at members of the museum staff who were clearly not Caucasian and saying, now you've got to go home. This is chilling. And Hate a Muslim Day is exactly in this bracket. Somehow these unscrupulous politicians have given people a license to hate. And there's all this nonsense talked about, let's make Britain great again. I will say, for God's sake, no, we did enough harm when we were in power before. Let's have another round of it. But we should be, I'm deeply disturbed by this.
How can we share conscience about that? Because it causes fear for us.
Of course.
I have family in Britain and they were afraid, they didn't go to work. So how can we fight that fear?
I think fighting is the wrong way. You say fight. Once you start fighting...
Avoid fear, sorry.
Sorry?
Avoid fear. Better word to say, avoid fear.
You can't avoid fear. And you're right to be afraid. Anybody should be right to be afraid if that kind of thing is being said in their society. But don't let it corrode you. And there are plenty of people, I would say, who are revolted by this kind of speech. And I think perhaps make a common cause, write to your members of parliament, for example. We've all, after the big march we had anti-Brexit, we were all told to write to our members of parliament, bombard them with letters so that this kind of thing is not acceptable, and take it to the highest people in the land. But you can't avoid this fear. You are going to be frightened. I am frightened to hear what you've said. I'm frightened that this is happening in my country. And it's not just in Britain. This is popping up all over Europe. It's certainly popping up in the United States. You saw it with the election of Mr. Trump. Do you remember when the Berlin Wall came down and people were dancing in the street with joy? Now, during the presidential election, people were cheering at the prospect of a wall being built between Mexico and the United States. Something ugly is emerging in the Western world. And I think we all have to be on our guard and aware of it, not pushing it under the carpet, but allowing ourselves to be kept awake at night by it, because we've seen what can happen in Europe when that kind of speech is encouraged. We've seen what happened, and we should all be very afraid, but to somehow try to counter it in a positive spirit. I don't, it takes, I don't know how. But be disturbed, be worried. Don't say, oh, well, this is just a few idiots. It's a very worrying symptom of something that is happening in European society, in Western society in general. And we should all be ashamed. Well, you're right, of course. This is terrifying and disgraceful. I think what we can't allow ourselves to be is depressed or just taking it for granted. I think it's time that we did things, we stepped outside the box a bit and tried to think, instead of, it's no good just making more statements, yet another march or yet another sort of statement in the press or in the parliament or whatever. Something has to be done that will catch the imagination of people. That means creative thinking. And one thing that I wanted to do, because in the charter, we've got a number of cities, there are about 400 cities around the world who have affirmed the Charter for Compassion, which was written by leading thinkers representing 7 major religious traditions. And one of the things I wanted them to do is, when we hear of, say, something like Boko Haram or some atrocity, or like those 140 Palestinian children who were killed by the Taliban, we should take flowers, for example, and take them to the Pakistani embassy. We're always taking flowers, when people are, after these terrorist attacks in Paris, candles, flowers everywhere, etc. Let's have a watch, an atrocity watch, in this, where we find out what's been going on around, bring it in an imaginative way to the attention of the community. Not haranguing them, because they're sick of words, but in a sense, making, I'm not very good at this kind of thing. I just sit at a desk all day and write books. But other people have got this kind of creativity. to think how we could act in such a way and make it habitual in a city when we hear that there's been an atrocity around the world to whomsoever, that we announce it in some kind of celebration and or reverence or remembrance. Candles, flowers, messages, whatnot. Just to enhance people's visions and to make us realize that we are now living in a global world. That despite the Brexit tears of this world, we are not living in the fundamentalists who are retreating into a minute, limited version of their religion and say everyone else is wrong. That we are living in a global world, whether we like it or not, we cannot live without one another. And somehow, what does the Quran say? We formed you all from a single man and a single woman and formed you into tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another. And that is the task for our time, getting to know one another. And that means finding out about these horrors and bringing them creatively. And young people can do that. I'm old now. I speak in the language of the past. You young people, in Britain, for example, it was the young people who voted to stay in the European Union. Let young people speak to us because the language is changing with the internet, with writing is changing, the way we express ourselves is changing, and I'm very much in the old world. You are young and you're in this new world. Use it in a creative way, as all the great thinkers and prophets did in the past, to find a new way of uttering the word of God in a tragic world.